Remember that scene from The Godfather when Michael Corleone sees a beautiful woman in Italy and kind of freaks out. His two Sicilian bodyguards see this and begin to talk about how he has been struck by a thunderbolt and is lost in love. This is not just a fantasy for the movies. I saw it with my own eyes, although at that moment I did not realize what it was. This happened to my wife. Unfortunately for me, this didn't happen to her when she met me. This happened to another man 25 years after our wedding and was the beginning of the end of what I thought was a perfect life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I often do this when I think about my past life and how things should have been but didn't work out. I think I should start at the beginning and introduce myself. My name is Alan Gregorson. Everyone calls me Greg. I'm 50 years old and live in a small town in the Midwest about 2 hours from Chicago. I am an accountant for a fairly large national firm. The work is quite monotonous, but the salary is good and, with the exception of March and April, working hours usually do not exceed 40 per week, without days off. I was married until 2 years ago. My ex-wife and I had one child together, a daughter named Morgan, who is 25 years old, married with one child and lives in Denver. My marriage ended after 26 years of marriage, the first 25 of which I thought were wonderful, as I said. I met Tracy at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa in the fall of my sophomore year. She was also a sophomore, but transferred to our dorm after her first year in another. I noticed her slender, athletic body behind the dorm, lying on a towel, sunbathing in the bright August Iowa sun. I was walking to the dorm with my friends when I saw her out of the corner of my eye. "Guys, I have to go. I'm going to meet the future Mrs. Gregorson," I said, not entirely jokingly. My two friends followed my gaze to Tracy. "Wow," one of them said. I heard the words, but I couldn't tell who was speaking. I was completely fascinated by this blonde goddess lying on a towel in a bikini on the side of the hostel. I just left my friends and went to introduce myself, but when I got about 4 feet away from her, she stood up on one elbow and started waving her other hand at me, shooing me away. I was depressed until she spoke. "Hey, fool, you're standing in my sun." I immediately jumped a foot to the right, which allowed the sun to fall on my goddess again. She flashed a dazzling smile at me, and at that moment I would have committed any crime on her orders. "Much better, fool," she giggled. She didn't seem embarrassed that a strange guy approached her. I think when you look like that, it probably happens all the time. I introduced myself, told her she was beautiful, and asked her out the following Friday night. "If I say yes, will you wipe the drool off your chin?" she asked flirtatiously. What? "Yes, saliva, saliva. Of course, I'll remove it immediately," I replied, like a horny, clumsy teenager. "Well, I see that you're clearly not one of those slick guys with prepared lines, so of course we can go on a date on Friday night." I took her phone number. We went to a little Italian restaurant in Ames that Friday night, and while I sat there like a love-struck puppy, she told me all about her life from age 3 to now. I think she only stopped because the main course arrived. We just found a common language, and after a month, we spent almost all our free time together. Not only was she smart, she was the top student in her school, but she also had a mischievous sense of humor and quiet confidence. I considered myself a pretty good-looking guy, not world-class, but pretty athletic, 7 school awards in high school, top 5 smart in my school, and could hold intelligent conversations about a variety of topics. Although, as Tracy noted, I wasn't the type of guy who always had a line ready, I was pretty confident in myself. But I knew I was lucky when she agreed to go on a date. Hey, you won't get anything if you don't ask, right? Tracy and I had sex for the first time on our 6th date. But despite my relative lack of experience, I had a secret weapon. I actually read articles in adult magazines rather than just looking at pictures. Many of these articles were about sex and pleasing a woman, not just about how to pleasure yourself. I paid special attention to these articles. I read some of them twice. Many thanks to the late, great Hugh Hefner. Thanks to him, I not only saw the best nude women in his magazines, but also met great writers such as John Updike and Alex Haley, and also learned that sex is a two-way street. Tracy and I got married shortly after graduating from university. We both easily found work. She became a third-grade teacher, and I became an accountant. We had good, stable incomes. A couple of years later, we bought a house, and almost a year after moving into the house, our only daughter was born. Life was good. Our sex life, while not wild, was varied and fairly frequent for both of us, although, like many couples, time and age take their toll on frequency. However, when Morgan left for college, we still did it enthusiastically 3 to 4 times a week. Over the years, I have had moments when I worried about Tracy's loyalty, but they were very rare. For example, she might say something about the new young teacher at her school who is a bit of a flirt, but she never gave me any indication that she responded to it in any way or that anything went further, so I always put it down to my paranoia. I'm not blind, she's still attractive, and I couldn't blame any man for even looking at her, but just looking. In my world, there is no room for division. I made this clear to Tracy at the beginning of our relationship. She responded in kind, saying she felt the same way. She didn't mind if I looked at the other woman, but if there was any touching, I would be in serious trouble. I was completely fine with this. And so it was until 3 years ago. We were at the annual summer party thrown by our neighbors 3 doors down in our trendy neighborhood. Scott and Wendy Harris always had a big party at their house, the weekend after Independence Day. Tracy and I go there every year, as do most of the neighbors on our block, and always have a great time. Scott and Wendy are great hosts, the food and drinks are great, and they have a large pool and sand volleyball court. Even the invited outsiders are usually good people, with one exception, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. The party starts at noon, and Tracy and I arrived around 1 o'clock. I walked up to the bar, got some white wine for Tracy and Michelob for ourselves, and we began to communicate, first together and then separated, as each of us was carried away by various conversations taking place both inside and outside the house. This has never been a problem before. From time to time, I would return to Tracy to see if she needed a drink refreshed or a plate of snacks needed. Sometimes she found me herself. We usually left each other with a quick kiss. I was chatting with a group of male neighbors, and Tracy was on the other side of the yard talking to a group of women when several strangers appeared in the garden. It was a man with 2 women, and Scott went to greet them. And at that moment, I saw the thunderbolt hit Tracy. After I looked at the new arrivals, I happened to look at Tracy, who had stopped talking to her friends and was staring at the new people with an expression on her face that I can now describe as a mixture of amazement and pure passion. At that time, I could not understand what kind of look it was, only that she looked stunned, and I have to admit, my spidey senses started to flutter. She looked at the trio for about 10 seconds, then turned in my direction, saw me, looked me straight in the eyes, and blushed deeply. She then returned to her friends and took part in the conversation again. When do you have that strange feeling that something is wrong with the world, but you can't figure out what it is? This feeling came to me about an hour later, and I felt uneasy when I searched the entire yard and did not find Tracy. I walked over to the bar, grabbed another white wine for her, and started wandering around the garden until I finally found her in the Harris living room with 4 other people, including the same guy Tracy had been eyeing earlier. In fact, he hugged her. It looked a little too comfortable for me, especially since she had just met this guy, and all 5 of them seemed to be having a friendly conversation. I'm confident and trust my wife completely, and I didn't want to make a scene, but I felt like this stranger was being too handsy. I walked up to the group behind Tracy and her new friend, grabbed his wrist tightly, and pulled his hand off of her. I don't think we've dated, even though you clearly feel too comfortable with my wife, I said with a hard tone in my voice. He started to turn, but my death grip on his wrist kept him from leaving. Tracy, who had already looked embarrassed before I approached, blushed even more when she realized I was there. "Oh, Greg, please," she almost screamed. "Greg, this is Charles Deland. He teaches European literature at the college. He's been here since last year. He's French, he didn't do anything inappropriate, so I just left his hand where it was." The rest of the group nodded in agreement, so I let go of Charles's wrist and shook his hand firmly, squeezing a few bones in the center of his palm. Tracy then introduced me to the rest of the group, seemingly in a hurry. "Thought you might need a recharge," I told her, handing her a glass of wine and looking straight at Charles. "You are so attentive, my dear husband," she replied. Charles, pronounced Charles in French, looked like a typical Eurobum to me. Admittedly, he was a pretty good-looking guy, about 32 years old, about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds, with 3 days of stubble and somewhere between long hair and needing a haircut. He had a full French accent in his English, and I thought he probably slept with half of his students, both girls and guys. After the introductions, he began to talk again about Victor Hugo or someone else, and satisfied that I had made my presence known, I returned to the garden. Tracy and Charles arrived in the backyard for the start of sand volleyball. I was always the main player in these games, and since we were playing on the winning field, my team spent a lot of time playing. We always had a fairly large audience on the terrace, and Tracy sat there with Charles next to her. I was a little too busy with the gaming going on to pay much attention to the couple, but I noticed a lot of hand and arm touching, smiling, and the occasional blush on my wife's face. Sometimes I waved to her, and she waved back. My team won several games and was still holding the field an hour later when I noticed that Tracy and Charles were no longer sitting in their seats. I looked at the bar and grill area and didn't find them there either. My spidey senses were fluttering the most, so I told one of the guys to relieve me, telling the team that my 47-year-old legs were tired and that I needed a glass of beer urgently. There's not much of me that kept quiet when I left with sand. To keep up appearances, I walked up to the bar and grabbed another Michelob. Then I wandered around the yard a little more before heading into the house. I walked around all the open rooms and listened carefully to the 2 closed doors, but neither saw nor heard either Tracy or Charles. Finally, I approached the owner, Wendy, and innocently asked if she had seen my wife in the last few minutes. "Yes, she and Charles went to look at something in his car, I think," Wendy answered indifferently. "What does he drive?" I asked somewhat irritably. Then a light bulb came on above Wendy's head. "We have been neighbors and friends for over 15 years. A very worried look appeared on her face, and she replied, a gray sob. I ran outside and looked around. Not a sob in sight. At that moment, Wendy came up to my entrance. "I'm sure it's no big deal, Greg," she said in her most soothing voice. "They were probably just stopping by the college for a minute." "Yes, thank you. It's probably okay," I answered without much confidence. I turned and walked away. The local college was a 5-minute drive from home. I'll go and see for myself. I drove around every parking lot there was in college. No sob. I called Tracy on her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, which meant she was either talking to someone else or her phone was off. I left a message. I left 4 more messages over the next hour while I sat at home. I also called her parents and sister, asking if they had heard from her today. Everyone answered negatively. An old Sherlock Holmes quote came to mind: "Once the impossible has been eliminated, what remains, however improbable, must be true." I settled into my rocking chair in the family room and stared at the empty big screen for several hours. I didn't have to turn on the TV to see any images because in my mind's eye, I could see my beautiful wife cheating with that French bastard. Why the hell did we save this country through 2 world wars? The Germans should have been allowed to keep it. I didn't sleep a wink all night, sitting in my chair and watching TV. I half expected Tracy to sneak into the house in the middle of the night, but when it didn't happen, I thought maybe Charles had been in a car accident with Tracy in the car. I called the local sheriff's department around 8 a.m., told them who I was, and asked if they had any accidents overnight. I was told that there was none. I called Tracy's phone 4 more times, got the same thing 4 times. As the afternoon approached, I heard a car pull into the driveway and someone get out, judging by the sound of one door slamming. After about 45 seconds, Tracy inserted the key into the lock, opened the door, and entered. After a few more seconds, she noticed me in the family room and quietly sat down on the couch on the other side of the room. If I had any doubts about what had happened, they were quickly dispelled by her appearance. At least she had the decency to shower before coming home. Her long blonde hair, which had been down yesterday, was pulled back into a ponytail that looked damp, and she was completely devoid of makeup. She was wearing the same yellow summer dress she had worn yesterday, and the skin on her chest, shoulders, and arms glowed pink. She looked satisfied, like a woman who had had a great night, and I have to admit, she looked great. She also didn't look the least bit remorseful or guilty, and, if anything, she had a condescending grin on her face. "It's so nice to have you back. Had a good time last night. And this morning?" I asked sarcastically. "Actually, yes," she replied smugly. This was not exactly what I expected to hear. "Listen, Greg," she continued calmly. "Have you ever had such an amazing physical and emotional connection with someone from the moment you saw them? I mean, completely amazing, almost electric, and wonderful, and amazing?" "Yes, it happened," I answered immediately. "I married this woman." This wasn't exactly what she expected to hear because her completely calm demeanor was finally shattered. Her almost glass-smooth calm was broken, and the depth of my despair finally appeared in her eyes. I met mine yesterday. I cannot explain it. I need to be with him. I love him. Just, you are crazy," I shouted. "Are you leaving 25 years of marriage because of a feeling? Did I even mean anything to you?" I don't know why she didn't expect my outburst. She began to sob uncontrollably from my scream. I did not care. "I love you, Greg," she finally managed through her sobs. "What we had was wonderful, but this is simply the most amazing connection I've ever experienced with anyone in my life. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It is amazing." "Marvelous. I understand. Give me some time to get used to this, and I'll throw you a damn party," I blurted out. "So do you want to file for divorce, or should I do it?" I continued. "There will be an equal division of property, and we will sell the house and split the money too." "I don't think we should be in such a rush to get a divorce," she said with a hint of irritation in her voice. "Let's just see how this all plays out. We can make bigger decisions later." Now it was my turn to be annoyed. "What?" I moaned. "That's not how it works. You can't keep me in reserve. If you sleep with him, you might as well be with him as soon as possible. As far as I'm concerned, we were done when you slept with him for the first time yesterday. Having sex with him multiple times since then has only strengthened my resolve." But, she began. "Okay, then I'll file for divorce, and I'll move out before the end of the week." True to my words, I moved out of the house by the end of the week. I took a few personal days off from work and did this. As I loaded up my truck that evening, Scott and Wendy Harris came from the end of the street and apologized to me for inviting Charles to their party. I politely stopped them, noting that they had no way of knowing that Tracy would fall in love with this guy. "Still, we can't help but feel responsible," Wendy said as she and Scott looked at their boots. "My lawyer prepared the divorce papers and Tracy was given 1 month's notice. Apparently, she thought I would stall for time as she suggested, because my lawyer told me that the bailiff said she made a fuss when he handed her the papers. Which explains why 2 days later she showed up at my new apartment and burst in when I answered her call. "How could you do this if you love me as much as you say you do?" she attacked when she entered my apartment. I was shocked at first, but quickly came to my senses as my anger took over. "Are you seriously stupid?" I shouted back. "You are sleeping with another man. What did you expect me to do? I may love you, but I am not your willing cuckold. And if it doesn't work, what should I do then? Just give me some time. If this doesn't work, I'll come back to you and be the best wife in the world. We can grow old together." "You're delusional," I replied. "I don't give you permission to sleep with your dreamy guy until you figure out if he's the right guy for you. Besides, if he's your ideal, why shouldn't it work?" Charles is divorcing his wife, and they are having some financial problems. Translation: he may be Mr. Paul's perfect to you, But you're not his Miss Perfect, I asked. More of her stuttering before I finally told her to get out of my apartment or I would throw her out myself. Tracy and her lawyer did everything they could to drag out the process. Meanwhile, Mr. Bancharming moved into my old house and took my place. 4 months later, I'm leaving Shay Mitchell with a colleague after a business dinner when I noticed a familiar face, two familiar faces, actually approaching the door. It was Charles and an obviously pregnant Tracy. She looked about 3 months old. I froze in place and stared, blocking their entrance to the restaurant. "Oh God," I muttered under my breath. My colleague also stopped, not understanding why we were standing face to face. "Serge, let me introduce my wife at least for a few more months and her lover, Charles Delan." Serge found himself in the awkward position of trying to be polite in an extremely awkward situation. I think he did well. M. Zamiam Lil He. She's pregnant. It's yours." "It's definitely his," I answered happily. "You're a bastard, Greg. Do you know about this?" she said, walking past Charles and me and entering the restaurant. Later, I learned from Wendy Harris that Tracy was indeed in her 3rd month. Apparently, Charles was such a wonderful man that Tracy wanted to have a child with him and stopped taking the pills. "Good luck with that," was all I said to Wendy. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and Tracy gave birth to a son 2 months later. Of course, they named him Charles Jr., because when you're so beautiful, what could be better than naming another person after you? Our daughter Morgan was not particularly happy with Tracy's decision to have another child at this age, especially since her parents were no longer together and I was no longer the father. I was proud of my daughter for taking my side in this situation. Although I knew she had given birth, I had not spoken to or seen Tracy since I ran into her at the restaurant many months ago. I guess I knew it would happen sooner or later since we both lived in the same city, but I have to admit I was more than a little surprised when I saw Tracy for the first time after she gave birth. The extra weight wasn't doing her any favors, and the whole experience seemed to be hard on her 49-year-old body. I almost walked past a slightly grandmotherly woman pushing a stroller with a roughly 1-year-old boy in the shopping center. "Hey, Greg, there's no reason to be downright rude," a familiar voice said as I hurried past the couple one Saturday afternoon. I froze in place and, despite my efforts not to do so, made an almost slow double movement towards the woman and child. Oh damn, it was Tracy and her son. "Hello, stranger," I said, trying to collect my thoughts. "Hello to you too," she replied. Of course, the child was beautiful. He had Tracy's hair and eye color, but his father's slightly darker complexion. "Wow, Mom, he's beautiful," I said honestly. Tracy blushed slightly and thanked me for the compliment. "I haven't seen you for a long time, and—" "With the stroller," I said, apologizing for not recognizing you at first. Although she visibly flinched when I apologized for not recognizing her right away, she did a good job of pretending to shrug it off. Although I had thought she was incredibly sexy after giving birth to Morgan all those years ago, she was now 20-something years older, and since the baby wasn't mine, I guess my hormones were completely under control. We talked amiably for a few more minutes, mostly about her lack of sleep, and I noticed a hint of real sadness that she had never shown since Morgan was born. Finally, I apologized and left to continue shopping for what I came for. The next time I saw Tracy was at the Harrises' summer party about 6 months later. Scott and Wendy always felt terrible that it was at their party that Tracy met Charles, but I told them at the time and meant it that I didn't blame them for Tracy's bad decision. However, Wendy was constantly trying to get me meetings with her single and divorced friends, and I have to admit that some of these meetings were pretty good. However, they kept inviting me to their annual summer party, and after missing the previous two, I decided to go again, even though they warned me that Tracy and Charles would be there too. I told them that if there was a problem, I wouldn't be the cause, and I meant it. I had been at the party for a couple of hours when I saw Tracy and Charles coming into the backyard. Since there was no child with them, I assumed that he was with the nanny. Tracy had lost some of the weight she had gained during her pregnancy, and didn't look as grandma-like as the last time I saw her, but I still couldn't forget the look of sadness in her once bright blue eyes. Even when I saw her smile, there was something missing in her eyes. I immediately decided to remove the elephant from the room and walked up to Tracy and Charles, gave her a little hug, and shook his hand. They both seemed a little dazed, and I think I saw Wendy hold her breath as I walked toward the couple. We chatted for maybe a minute, then I excused myself and returned to my group at the grill. When sand volleyball started, I joined one of the teams. My team was playing the second game, and while I was on the sand, I noticed Tracy sat down to watch and cheer. I haven't seen Mr. Wonderful. We played 2 games, losing the second, so we had to clear the field and wait for our next turn. While I was getting my beer, I looked at Tracy just sitting there by herself. Old habits die hard, I thought to myself. I took the beer and headed into the house. The third room I checked was the same one. Charles hugging Marilyn Jansen, talking in a small group, and Marilyn herself looking at him with lust in her eyes. Marilyn was my former neighbor down the street, and she was definitely married. I should mind my own business, I thought. If it's what I think, he's going to sleep with this woman tonight and cheat on Tracy. If I don't tell her, I'll be wrong. If I say it, there will be hell, and I will still be wrong. A real friend would have said something, but I wasn't a real friend, I was her ex-husband. Why should this be my responsibility? And then fate took this decision out of my hands. Marilyn's husband, Troy, was on my sand volleyball team and apparently followed me inside to talk about some strategy when he noticed the same thing I did. Charles hugging his wife and his wife looking at Charles like it's covered in honey. "You son of a bitch, get your hands off my wife, you bastard," he shouted, rushing towards the couple. I started to move to prevent the impending altercation, but common sense came to my aid, and I allowed my teammate to rush past me. There was a fight. The room quickly filled with bodies as people came to see what the noise was. Luckily, one of Wendy's friends was an nurse. She called an ambulance. They arrived about 10 minutes later along with 2 policemen. The police took statements from everyone who was in the room at the time in case Charles wanted to file a complaint against Troy Jansen. The senior member of the team was Sergeant Jim Hill, who looked my age. The junior member of the team was Officer Kathleen McDonald, who looked to be about 40 years old and as Irish as her name, with freckles, green eyes, and long orange hair. I specifically walked to the side of the room where Officer McDonald was to give her my statement. In the middle of it all stood a crying Tracy, holding on to Charles' good hand and trying to calm him down while the paramedics worked. I knew she had no idea what had happened. Once the paramedics stabilized Charles, they put him in the ambulance, but told Tracy she would have to get to the hospital herself. She looked at me like a beaten dog, so I nodded at her, but pointed at Officer McDonald, holding up 5 fingers. McDonald saw that Tracy was waiting for me, so she questioned me next. I gave her my view of what happened, including the fact that Charles stole my wife at this party 3 years ago. She looked surprised by my comment. "And you're still going to take her to the hospital to see him?" she asked. "Are you such a kind person or a complete idiot?" I have to admit, I didn't expect this. I looked at her and saw that she was holding back a smile. "A complete idiot," I replied. She did not expect this either and laughed quietly. I liked this sound. A few more questions, and I'm done giving my testimony. She said I could take Tracy to the hospital, but before I left, she warned me that Tracy probably wouldn't believe me if I told my version of events. "I don't expect her to believe it," I replied. I started to turn, and she started to move towards the next person to interrogate. But a quick thought flashed into my head, and I immediately voiced it. "Perhaps you should give me your card in case I remember anything else, officer." She grinned back at me, her eyes literally glowing. She took a business card from the top left pocket of her uniform, turned it over, and wrote what I assumed was her personal phone number. "Thank you, officer," I laughed in response, then put on a serious face and turned to Tracy. Went. On the way to the hospital, Tracy asked me what happened to Charles. I told her the truth and was not surprised that she did not believe me. "Can't you just let it go, Greg?" she whined. It's been 3 years. It's not about letting go, Trace, I replied. Charles, I accented the name as SHSHSHARRRL, should not have laid his hand on Marilyn Jansen, and Troy, I did the right thing in doing so. Hell, maybe if I had been as determined, you and I would still be together. Neither of us expected this to come out of my mouth. Tears began to form in the corners of Tracy's eyes before she turned away from me in the pickup truck. I dropped Tracy off at the emergency room and didn't go with her. She had to call a taxi to get back to the small house she and Charles had shared since we sold our house and split the proceeds after our divorce. With her gone for the evening, I pulled Officer Kathleen McDonald's business card from my shirt pocket. Wonderful lady, I thought. I tried to stay calm, so I waited 3 days before I called Officer Kathleen McDonald. She answered the second ring. Couldn't you have waited longer? I could already be engaged and married. She mimicked me on the phone. I guess you're right, but if you move so fast, you'll never be the next and last Mrs. Alan Gregorson, I answered. Now who's the cocky one here? She answered. How do you know I'll even say yes when you ask me out? And no, I don't want to go to some Irish pub on a date. She caught me off guard with her Irish pub comment because, frankly, that's exactly what I had in mind. It just seemed like the right decision to take the Irish girl to an Irish pub. She noticed my hesitation and realized that she had guessed right. What the hell is wrong with you guys? Don't have any creativity? You see fiery red hair and immediately think Irish pub. I hesitated for a second before coming up with Plan B. We had a top-notch Greek restaurant in town that I absolutely adored, and Greek food is quite a step up from Irish food. She thought for just a split second before answering positively. Thanks for a little creativity on the go, she said. When I turn down an Irish pub, most guys go straight to Asian food. Sorry, but I'm not a big fan of food that looks like it might have cockroaches in it. I laughed out loud at this, and I think at that moment I realized that I might have found someone I could grow old with. We talked for another hour about everything and nothing. I found out that she is actually 45 years old and has been divorced for 10 years. It seems her ex-husband also had fidelity issues. She has a son who is a sophomore at the University of Michigan studying law. Dinner on Saturday night was great, and the company was fantastic. I picked her up from her house on the south side of town and was almost stunned by how good she looked in her little black dress with 4-inch heels. Curves in all the right places, great legs, a pretty face, and all that bright red hair. The woman was a living poster for the term beautiful. We had one of those conversations again that involved everything and nothing. I could listen to this voice all night. She was not trying to find a husband as quickly as possible, just as I was not going to rush to find a wife. It made her relaxed and dangerous at the same time because she had almost the natural curiosity of a cop. She asked deep questions, and I could tell she was thinking as she listened to my answers. I took her home after dinner. I didn't invite her over, and when we got to her house, she didn't invite me inside either. We said goodbye at her door, then she quickly leaned over and kissed me softly on the cheek. I know I blushed 3 shades of red, said goodnight, and literally floated out to my car. I don't remember the way home. Damn, I felt like I was 16. Her lips were soft on my cheek, and I'm pretty sure she was wearing White Shoulders perfume. She called me on Sunday morning, inviting me to join her for salmon bagels at her house. How could I refuse such an invitation? Wendy and Scott invited me to dinner a few days later to apologize for everything that happened and also to get my side of the story. It seems Charles threatened to sue them, as well as Troy Jansen. This guy must think he's God's gift to women, Scott exclaimed at one point. He's quite handsome, dear, and very charming, I must admit, Wendy said before Scott glared at her. Troy spent the rest of that weekend in jail before being released on bail Monday morning, Harris said. When he returned home, Marilyn and their 2 children were gone. They went to her mother in a neighboring town. Scott noted that their 12-year marriage is likely over. Well, give Troy my number and let him know that I, as well as anyone, understand what he's going through. I'll be there if he needs someone to talk to, and I will support him when this case comes to court. We'll pass it on to him, and I'm sure he'll appreciate it. Harris. And by the way, this was the last summer party we threw. I can't handle that kind of pressure. Wendy's eyes were fixed on the peas on her plate as Scott spoke. I got the feeling that in Harrisland things haven't been going well since the party. When Wendy, 47, began showing off her pregnancy in public a few months later, my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't have to guess who the father probably was because Scott himself called me to let me know. Can you believe this shit? He practically shouted into the phone when I answered. That bastard got my wife pregnant. She slept with that creep from last year's party. Scott told me he had no idea until Wendy started throwing up every morning. It was the same pattern she had when she was pregnant with their 2 children many years ago. When Scott realized everything and demanded an explanation, she admitted that she and Charles had an affair for over a year, but most of it ended over one long weekend when they both lied to their families and got a motel room. Scott then asked me the name of my lawyer. Can I get a discount for friends and family? He joked dryly. Scott told me that Charles and Wendy had moved into an apartment near campus, leaving Tracy and her son to fend for themselves. It's not my problem, I replied. But then I didn't expect what female psychology is capable of. I was eating lunch at a local McDonald's when she walked up to my table holding her son's hand. She placed the tray of food on the table opposite me, and the child sat down in the seat to my left. Hi, Tracy. Hello, Charles, I said to the couple. The child, who was about 3 years old, held out his clean hand for a proper handshake. I was impressed, so I shook the little hand and squeezed it tightly. Hello, sir, he said in his most serious voice. Hi, Greg, Tracy added. He's really growing, I told Tracy, looking at her son. Maybe you'll have a 6-foot guy someday. I could tell from her face that Tracy appreciated my efforts to be civil. But I also saw that something was bothering her, and if she didn't deal with it, her head was going to explode. Ask me already, I said, gently nudging her as I watched her son unwrap the cheeseburger. Did you ever really love me as much as you said you did? She began quietly. Because if he loved, then why didn't he fight for me like Troy did for Marilyn? Why never ask me to come back, like someone who truly loves me? Why didn't you come to my house to see how my son and I were doing and invite us to spend the evening together? I didn't expect this. What if it's all my fault? I took a deep breath and shook my head. I wanted to remain calm and not respond to her with anger. Woo-oh, I exhaled. So this is all on me? Seriously? Are you the innocent victim here? My voice began to rise. This is not what I wanted. I needed to get my point across. Woo-oh, I exhaled again, raising my hand. If you remember, I removed Charles's hand from your waist, but you insisted that nothing was going on and that I shouldn't cause problems. Since I completely trusted you and your word, I did not go further. I'm sorry for trusting you completely. Knowing what I know now, I wouldn't trust you and I would break his arm like Troy did. But you, the person I trusted most in this world, lied to me, and that's why I didn't fight for you. Then, when you came home the next day at noon, what could I say? The deed has been done. Many times, by the looks of you. So I had nothing to fight for. You made it clear. You made it crystal clear. It was your sole decision, and I had no say in it. So I had nothing to fight for. You were no longer mine. You were his. But you didn't even try to change my mind, she whined, or make me stay. Nothing, if you really loved me. How many times did you have sex with Charles that first night? And morning? I bet it happened a few times, I said. One time would be a terrible mistake, but perhaps I could forgive you. Twice was already a conscious choice. Moreover, it was you who broke my heart by having the audacity to tell me that you had a wonderful time. If I remember correctly, an amazing time, and that you have an almost supernatural connection with him. You didn't regret anything. So what could I do? As they say, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it was yours. If not, it was never yours. And then to add to it all, you gave birth to his child at 48 years old. I couldn't talk you into having a second child in 25 years, but not only did you sleep easily with Mr. Beeger Charming, but you also let him get you pregnant. So this is all because of your bruised male ego, she said, perhaps a little too harshly for my taste. My head shot up, but with a child sitting at the table with us, I did not succumb to provocation. No, what you did when you became his was your choice. You apparently loved him enough to want to have his child, even if you never wanted another with me. Believe me, I understand. We ate in silence for several minutes. She looked hesitant. I knew where this was going, but someone had to voice it. So what's your plan now? I finally asked. You and Charles never got married, but he's listed as the baby's father, right? At the very least, you should demand alimony. I'll let Wendy take him, Tracy said. But you're right, I have to demand alimony from this cheater. This is good advice. Do you ever think about us sometimes? She added. What would it be like? Honestly, no, I answered quietly. You broke my heart so completely that I never wanted to think about what could have been. I have wonderful memories of our past life that I will cherish forever, but it's gone and will never come back. We continued to eat. I watched a boy play with French fries. I remembered the time our daughter Morgan did the same. He is a good boy. I'm glad something good came out of that relationship. You know, even though we started out with this amazing connection, we ended up not connecting the way you and I did. I mean, the sex was great at first, I won't lie, but we never really grew together as a couple. Love did not replace lust when lust faded. And in that moment, it seemed to hit her, a moment of realization. She shook her head sadly, tears starting to form in the corners of her eyes. She traded the warmth and security of love for the lightning strike of lust. And like a real lightning strike, it had a moment of brilliance before fading away. My sweetie and I just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to surprisingly Spain. I suggested she take a mandatory trip to her homeland, and after she punched my arm hard enough to leave a mark, she decided we needed to go somewhere warmer and edgier. Warm and spicy describes our relationship well. We have a few more years of work ahead of us before we retire from the computer security company we founded together several years ago. We've done well since I left engineering and she left the police to start a company. We are almost always together, both professionally and personally, and it never gets boring. I know it sounds corny, but I think I love her more every day. We have 5 grandchildren from our 2 children, and even though one family lives in Denver, Colorado, and the other in Houston, Texas, we still see our grandchildren regularly. I sometimes run into Tracy around town, but it's rare that we say more than a couple of sentences to each other. She is busy raising Charles, who is now about 13 years old. She is still unmarried and rarely dates anyone, according to my daughter, who sometimes talks to her mother. It looks like Mr. Charming had to be literally dragged to jail to start paying child support regularly. I think it's a sad life without much joy, but hey, we all make our choices in life and have to live with them. I'm certainly not going to apologize for moving on with my life. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.